Well, greetings everyone and welcome again to God's Unchanging Word and this week's edition for our news, nuggets, and insights. Today is Friday, December 22nd, 2017. One more week to the end of 2017. You know, God has blessed us now to be able to bring you a news, nuggets, and insights every week for 2017. And thanks to you and your viewership, we've watched it grow throughout the year, including the growth of our mailing list. And we want to thank you for tuning in and being a part of our program. And more importantly, to thank you for sharing these programs with your friends. We've seen a lot of input, questions, and support over the course of the year, and we want to thank you for that. And we're going to hopefully, with God's help, bring 2018 to be more important than 2017. We've got a lot of information to bring you today in News Nuggets and Insights, and we're going to begin with the Pope's Hero Cake. I don't know if you heard about the Pope's Hero Cake. What a name for a cake. But more importantly, how he used this cake to trash President Trump. Then we're going to talk about Jerusalem and the response to our embassy move. And you're going to see it's quite heartening that we need to be aware of what's going on around the world with this potential move. Then we're going to bring in the biblical portion of our News Nuggets and Insights to focus on Jerusalem, and specifically one scripture that talks about armies that surround Jerusalem. So as you can see, the whole program today is going to be focused in and around Jerusalem and the end time prophecy of what's right at our doorstep. All right, so let's begin with the Pope. The Pope's 81st birthday cake. Is it prophetic? When I first saw this cake, I looked at that and said, wow, this is kind of interesting. And it was kind of eerie, which we're going to bring out in just a few minutes. I looked at this cake and I'm looking at Revelation chapter 13. And so when we look at this cake, what are we looking at? They call it the hero cake with a message to the world. And that's amazing what you can put together in one little picture. Remember the phrase, a picture's worth 1,000 words? Well, this picture is worth 1,000 words. And you see how he's right next to that hero cake here. That's a pizza. It's one long pizza. So they gave him pizza and a cake for his 81st birthday. But look what the president did. Look what the Pope did to our president of the United States. Let's bring up that in just a moment. There's specifically two messages that are on the surface for the world to see with this cake. First, it shows how this is a broken world being stitched together and being carried by the Pope. Now, I don't know if you can see it close enough yet, so let me do this. Here's the Pope, and there's the world, of course, you can see that. But right down the middle, it's stitched together. In other words, the world's falling apart. The Pope's putting it back together, and he's going to carry it on its back. Now, remember, keep that visual in your head when we go back to read Revelation 13. The second is this. It says that it appears that a ball is in the court, or in other words, it appears that the ball is in the Pope's court, and the world expects him to carry it. Now, the reason I put this in here is this. The way it's stitched up, it looks like the seams of a baseball. So in other words, the world is reaching a point where it's going to take the ball and put it into the Pope's court now and say, okay, it's your ball to carry now. You do it and fix this world. And we're seeing him do that week by week because he continues to interject himself into political policy, especially the United States and the UN. But there's also one more message. This is an underlying message that's not so visible, and this message is for God's people. So what's the message? Let's take a look at that. Here's the hero cake, and there's a warning. So I'm going to put this in for God's people. The hero cake with a warning message to the world. So God says we're supposed to be able to view things with spiritual eyes, that we don't wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities of this world. When we look at that, we're seeing something on a greater scale than just a physical cake that's in front of us. I have to wonder when you see these things, is God allowing Satan to rise up to infiltrate in the mindset of the people around the world to begin to make his move toward the end time? Revelation 13 says this, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns were 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Now, what I've put up here on our screen here, this is the church's website. www.thecogmi, which is the acronym for the church.org. What I'd like for you to do, if you have some time over the holidays, we don't have all these to mail out right now because they're not in print, and we don't have the time to go back and print everybody to mail them all out again. But they are available online. We have a 3-part series that you can watch online. You can download it, put it into your computer. You can make DVDs out of it, and you can share it with all your friends. It goes into the specifics of the end time, of the rise of this beast at the end time. It's called the Holy Roman Revival. It's about 3 hours of specific information, and it talks a lot about Revelation chapter 13. So when you see these things, and you see this cake, you see the interjection of the Pope, you need to know who he is and what the Bible talks about with the beast. I got one more scripture in chapter 13 I'm going to bring out. I didn't want to take the time to go through the whole chapter today because some of you probably know it, but it's a good time to review. Look what verse 7 says. It was given unto him to make war with the saints. All right, let me stop for a second. When you see that cake and you see that underlining view for God's people that's not seen by the rest of the world, when you see this man rising up with the whole world looking at it now, laying in the subliminal thought of everyone out there that it's going to be the Pope who's going to take and put this world back together and save it. That ought to give you some alarms. When that happens, same chapter now, verse 7, it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. So that might just be a cake to the rest of the world, and it might be cute to many people. But when you see a message like that, please understand that the principalities of this earth is giving us warning that he's about to rise up and to do something. And we, as God's people, better take notice of verse 7. That's why we've worked so hard with our news nuggets and insights and our sermons every week to try to give people the insight of what the Bible is showing us in light of prophecy and the events that's come into play. Because that little cake, I'm going to tell you something, that little cake says more than we can ever imagine. And the concern I have for all of us and God's people, is it coming to pass soon? Now, I'm going to show you the rest of this program that it is a real possibility. It may be coming upon us quicker than we ever dreamed. All right, so now, let's go on. Now, the Pope now, he's taking this information with the cake, he's imposing his will into world decisions. Now, we haven't really seen that in a long, long time. They've done that over the centuries. But now, this Pope is now rising up to do it quite often. The Pope speaks out against President Trump, and I put again. All right, so here, now try to imagine this. It was just a few weeks ago that the United States, with the announcement of President Trump, announced that they are going to recognize Jerusalem as their capital, and we're going to move our embassy over into Jerusalem. Well, look how fast he got an audience with the Pope, Mahmoud Abbas, with the capital of Palestine. Look how fast that was. All right, so I wanted to bring that to your attention because you just don't do that. You just don't get those kind of audiences. So there's more at play going on right now than we imagine. That's why we're trying to bring this to you. This is the third time in a series of rebuttals against President Trump's decisions. It seems like now, every time the United States does something to bring the United States closer to our foundation, closer to the protection it should have, and closer back to God, the Pope speaks up and raises his voice against the president. The first time we began to see that is in his stance for immigration, when he talked about we should be able to protect our own borders. The second time we see it is in climate change, and we brought that out in the sermon at the feast, and we also offered that, and if you don't have it yet, Be sure to write for it. It's 2 years into the millennium. And we talk about how climate change, how the Pope is using that to raise up the attention of the world against the United States, and we eventually will move against God's people. And now we're talking about Jerusalem. This move by the United States absolutely is hated by everyone in the Middle East and abhorred by most of the rest of the world. Try to imagine this. Every nation on the face of the earth has its own sovereignty to decide where it wants to place its own capital. Everyone except Israel. The capital of Jerusalem has been set in place since King David. That will not change. And when we get into our biblical portion of News Nuggets and Insights today, we're going to show you how the possibility of the army surrounding Jerusalem and Jerusalem being the capital took nearly 100 years to come to pass. 50 years from the time they actually stepped foot back into having partial control of their own homeland. We're going to talk about that in the second portion of our program today. Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. The plans to change Jerusalem's status draws criticism from the Pope and from Iran. So the Pope used that opportunity December 6th to speak out against the president. The Pope took an indirect aim at Trump's administration in an audience in St. Peter's Square, expressing deep concerns over the escalation and tensions and pleaded for the respect of the city's status quo. Now, the reason they were asking for it to be status quo is because they don't want Israel to have control over that city. As long as everyone else has got their hands in the pot, at least they feel like they can at least do something to stop Israel. The truth is, they don't want Israel to exist at all. And if they had their way, there'd only be one state, and Israel would be wiped off the face of the earth. Meanwhile, Iran said that it will show no tolerance towards any change in the status of the city, which Iran says is a holy site in Islam. Imagine that, a holy site in Islam, the city where Jesus Christ will come back and place his foot on the Mount of Olives when he returns to this earth. They're claiming it is the holy site of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. In other words, it's everybody's city. It's not just the Jews. It's everybody's city. The response to the recognition to Jerusalem as Israel's capital has been rebellion across the world, violence in the Middle East, and even here in the United States, we've seen the protests right in front of the White House. So the embassies around the Middle East have braced themselves for potential violence following President Trump's announcement to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Fortunately, the insurrection didn't come about as strong as they thought it would, which was a surprise to many. But they're still bracing themselves for an unwarranted and unsuspected attack in embassies. The point that we're going to bring to and we're leading up to today is in Luke 21, verse 20. It's a scripture we know, we've read before. It says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. And we're going to talk about that toward the end time of our program today. Just yesterday, again, in response to the president's announcement, on Monday, December 18th, the UN met to pass a resolution to have the United States take back its move and to rescind its decision. Immediately, the United States vetoed the UN resolution rejecting the decision on Jerusalem. The other 14 members of the Security Council of the UN all voted for the Egyptian resolution. And the Egyptian resolution basically says that no nation can claim that Jerusalem is its capital or move its embassies into Jerusalem. On the floor, U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley called for the resolution an insult that won't be forgotten, she says, saying that the United Nations forced the United States to cast a veto simply because of its right to decide where to put its embassy. And she put out a very strong response. And if you haven't seen it yet, you need to find it and take a look at that. And it's just showing you the strength and the will of the United States at this particular time. The resolution that was vetoed would have called on all the states to refrain from establishing diplomatic missions in the holy city of Jerusalem, citing a 1980 council resolution. So we vetoed that, and the plans for the United States is to continue to make its move into Jerusalem. We're going to see that when it finally comes to pass, and they said it could take a few years before that happens, you will see the rise of escalation. Armies, will that be the armies that surround in Jerusalem? I don't know. Will it be the igniter that will begin to move to that territory? And time is quite possible that that may happen. Last weekend of the Christmas season, it's almost over. All right, so now before we get into the second portion of our program now, what I want to do is take a break. We've got a cute little video. Let's play that video, and I'll be right back to talk more about armies surrounding Jerusalem. I wanted to play that video in between here because for many people, this weekend is going to be a tough time in God's church. Many families are only one member of the family has been called to the truth. And for some, the children are having a difficult time, broken families. We need to remember to be able to understand the truth, as difficult it is, that we are truly blessed. So remember to pray for all those people who may be going through all these particular times this year. And during this season, especially to help those family members be able to come through this, to remember the calling that God gave them, to place the importance on that, and that God would give them peace during this specific time. Okay, let's go on. Jerusalem, our news, nuggets, and insights now. We're going to finish around Jerusalem. You know, when you read prophecy, sometimes you think, like, why is it taking so long to happen? And you begin to, like some people say, well, we've always heard that, we've always seen that. Well, you know, behind the scenes, that sometimes there's things taking place that we just not have contemplated that needs to come about, that God's working on to bring about the biblical fulfillment of a prophecy. We're going to talk about one today, and it's Jerusalem, and talking about armies surrounding Jerusalem. And we're going to take that and show you some history now of the past 500 years for it to get to the point that armies could actually surround Jerusalem. All right? So let's talk about that today. Jerusalem, here's the scripture. And when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation is nigh. Luke 21:20. Before Jesus Christ returned, you're going to hear this scripture being quoted many, many times down the road. So let's take a look at the history behind this and how it's going to come to pass and how long it took and what God's been doing for the last 500 years to bring us, and especially the last 100 years. Jerusalem, prophecies to come pass over the course of time, even centuries. So now, 1917 was the actual beginning of the movement of placing Jerusalem back into the hands of an Israelite nation. Did you know before this it wasn't that way? And it hadn't been that way for nearly 2,000 years. The Ottoman Turks are defeated at the Battle of Jerusalem during the First World War. That was the beginning of the change. Up until that point, the Ottoman Turks have been in control for Jerusalem for 400 years. In other words, the land that God gave Israel was in the hands of another nation. That nation was in control by the Ottoman Turks from 1517 till 1917. The British Empire's expeditionary forces under General Edmund Allenby drove the Turks out of the Levant. I put a circle around the Levant because people don't really know what the Levant is. I'm going to show you a picture of it, and I'm going to show you why it was so important and what this battle actually meant. Remember, we're not fighting flesh and blood. There's spiritual principalities that control this world. So we got 400 years in the area that I'm going to show you. When we bring this all up, you'll see why the Levant was so important and why Satan wants to control this land and why you're beginning to see the Pope and all these others bring about all the hatred that's going on today. Because, you see, they know the land that was given to Israel, and they don't want it to go back to the hands of Israel. And it began in 1917, and during the Sinai and the Palestinian campaign. Here's a picture of General Allenby to the Jaffa Gate, December 11th, 1917, as he dismounted his horse and he entered on foot with his men. In the future, we'll have in our programs, I'm going to go grab some of we got actually the video footage for this. It's a little long, and it's going to take some time to edit it and put some sound in, because there's no audio to it. It just shows you the black and white of General Allenby for the first time in 400 years now. Try to imagine that you're in that nation and you're a Jew and this is your city, and you're seeing British soldiers coming in. The armies are in Jerusalem at that time are defeated, and here comes a British general walking in for the first time to take control over Jerusalem. It's historic, and there's actual video footage. They made sure they had all the cameras in place so that this moment in time isn't forgotten. I wouldn't be surprised that in the millennium, when God brings us all to Jerusalem, that this video footage isn't played, but maybe from his camera perspective, not ours. So now, here's the Levant. If you're not familiar with the Levant is, in the Levant, you see it's kind of circled here. You see here's where Beirut is, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and you have right here, you have right there in the middle, you have Jerusalem, all right there in the middle. So why is this land so important? Let's bring up another map. Now you see what's up there now? This is the lands that God gave to Israel. If you look at those lands here, you will find them right here in the middle of the Levant. The reason it's so important is that Satan does not want these lands that God gave to Israel to go back to those hands. But God says in Luke that armies are going to surround Jerusalem. That means when you see this prophecy, you can go back 500 years. You can go back 100 years. You begin to see that it has to be in Israel's hands for there being armies to surround Jerusalem. So what we looked at in 1917, 100 years ago, 100 years ago, is the beginning of God bringing to fulfillment a prophecy, putting the hands of Jerusalem back into the hands of an Israelite nation. And here in 1917, whether people realized it or not, the Great Britain was an Israelite nation and is an Israelite nation. They're one of the lost tribes of Israel. And if you haven't studied that yet, you need to go back and take a look at the lost tribes of Israel, and you will realize that Great Britain is one of the tribes of Israel. So what we're looking at, even though Jerusalem isn't in control of the Jews, which was their homeland, it is now beginning to come under control of an Israelite nation. All right, so that's why this is so important. That's why that Levant was so imperative that these pagan nations control it? Because God says it is His. And they didn't want it to go to them. All right, so now, let's take a little history now for the last 100 years and some of the changes in control of that Jerusalem. 1920, just 3 years later, the League of Nations was formed, and there was a mandate in 1920 that it would come under, the land of Jerusalem would come under British and Palestinian rule from 1920 to 1948. The land around is called Palestine, but it would be ruled and controlled by Great Britain. It began with the conquest of Jerusalem and the foundation of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which promised British support for a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. That hasn't happened since 2,000 years. So it began at the Balfour Declaration that they were going to work for giving the Jews their own homeland. Again, the next step to the fulfillment of armies surrounding Jerusalem. All right? It would be 21 more years before that home would come to pass. All right, in our move for the last 100 years. Now we come to 1948. It is the next step to the control over Jerusalem, which is the nation of Israel reestablished. So let me stop for a second. They call themselves modern-day Israel, but it's primarily the nation of the Jews who are in that land that they're calling all of Israel. But when you look at the history of Israel, the 12 tribes, Judah was only one of 12 tribes, just like in the United States that we're here in Louisiana. We're just one of 50 states of the United States. Judah was one of the 12 tribes of Israel. But in modern day, they call the tribe of Judah, they call themselves Israel. So when you talk about Israel today, it's actually focused on Judah, which was Judah, Benjamin, and some of the Levites that were carried into Judah when the split began back in the Old Testament. So now, the nation of Israel, basically, which is Judah, I'll just go through now and I'll talk about them as Israel according to the way they declare themselves today. The nation of Israel is in existence from 1948. The British and Palestinian rule from 1920 to 1948 comes to an end. Right? It comes to an end under the Palestinian and British rule in 1948. So what I have here, another historical picture of the British removing their flag on May 14th, 1948, with the signing of the Declaration of Independence of Israel. The final troops leave Haifa, and on May 15th, 1948, the Palestinian mandate ended, and the State of Israel came into being. Now, for the first time in 1948, you see the nation of Israel finally established. In all this time, they never had their homeland. Once they were taken over by the other countries, they never had their own homeland. From 1948 to today, you see nothing but fighting and the terrorists and the bombings and the killings and murder and all these nations trying to get rid of that nation. And what they want to do is wipe Israel off the face of the earth. If they read these scriptures, they should know that's not going to happen. That Jesus Christ is going to step in before the end. And one of the things that's going to come to pass when these armies rise up is that scripture, Luke 21:20, armies surrounding Jerusalem. So now I've got a picture here of David Ben-Gurion, who is the first prime minister to take over Israel. Now I'm going to show you something else that you never think about. When God lays these plans, you know what else He's laying? He's laying the foundation for leadership to be able to run those nations. So in other words, God is not only working on lands, they're working on nations, they're working on food, water, and everything. He's also working on people. So now, I brought this out in a sermon that we just offered last month. If you haven't got it yet, please write for it, called Worthy to Escape. In fact, it may be even going out this month, right? That's right. It hasn't even gone out yet. It's called Worthy to Escape, and it's going to be in the mail next week for the newsletter. Be sure to write for that. We're talking about how God raises up people to do His bidding to bring about fulfillment. And this is what we said about David Ben-Gurion. This is a younger picture of him. It says that he took a humble peasant from Poland, and made him Israel's first prime minister. David Ben-Gurion, and he ruled over the modern-day Israel from May 17th, 1948 to January 26, 1954, during some of the most turbulent times in the history of their foundation. No different than the United States with 1776. Those beginning years are really tough on a nation. And so if you haven't gotten that yet, be on the lookout on our mailing list for Worthy to Escape. It's a very uplifting and a very powerful message about what God's doing with people. And if you're not on the mailing list, write in. Get on the mailing list so we can send you this sermon, and you're going to really appreciate what it is. Now, our next step in our movement of the last 100 years for God bringing about fulfillment takes place in 1967. All right, this is the next step to prophetic alignment came following the Six-Day War. Now, please understand, I'm just highlighting, these are just the highlights of the specific moves that were needed to bring about biblical fulfillment. From 1948 to today, there's no end of the problems that goes on and events that's taking place. I'm simply focused on specific events that focus on Jerusalem and the armies that are surrounding it. The Six-Day War, 1967. Following the Six-Day War, Israel now has total control over Jerusalem. And that's what you're seeing right now. The United States recognizing their total control and the rest of the world saying, no, this is not going to happen. And they're going to try to stop this. In fact, they are trying to stop this. So I simply brought a picture up from, and there's many, many pictures of what's going on here. How these nations around Israel tried to rise up to defeat them. And in 6 days, with the power of God, they defeated all the armies around them and brought it to an end in just 6 days. The Six-Day War, also known as the June War, is the Arab-Israeli War, or the third Arab uprising of the Israeli War. It was fought between June 5th and the 10th, 1967, by Israel and its neighboring states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. From 1967 on, and that means up till today, Israel is totally controlled in Jerusalem. So from then to this day, we have seen the control of Israel. So now, we ask the question, 2017, nations beginning to fight for control over Jerusalem. Is this the beginning of the armies surrounding Jerusalem? As I said at the beginning of this portion, I don't really know, but I'm telling you what it could be. It could be one of those catalysts that God will use to bring the anger around the world that's going to bring those armies to fulfill this prophecy. So now let's look at it from another perspective now. Let's look at it from the land of what took place, what God actually did over the last 100 years to bring about the possibility to fulfill that prophecy. All right, so this is 1946. Everything you see in green is controlled not by Israel, by other nations. All right, that's 1946 when Israel moves in. All right, you begin to see they have a little bit of land on the west side by the sea. Then you see 1947 when Israel now is beginning to have its own homeland. And following World War II, all the Jews from around the world, and specifically in Europe and the Asia countries, all start flooding back into the Promised Land. All right, so you see that now. So you see the green, how all of a sudden it's disappearing, and the Jews are taking back their homeland. Then you see by 1949 to 1967, with the establishment of their own country. Now what I did here is I put a little circle around Jerusalem. All right, you see where that's at. They controlled most of Jerusalem, but they didn't control all of Jerusalem yet. And you can see where they have began to take most of that land back from the Palestinians and all the other Arab nations from around them. Then in 1967 to today, you see that there is no green or no control by other countries around Jerusalem. They have total control. So for the last 8 years, President Obama kept saying, let's go back to pre-67 borders. Why? Because they want other countries to run Jerusalem, not Israel. And that's why Benjamin Netanyahu said that's not going to happen. He said they will never go back to pre-1967 borders. And you can trust they're not going to give up on that case. So you see now, we showed you historical facts of the changes of what was taking place in leadership and control by the nations. Now you see, as those changes took place, the land changes. God's in control of all of that. God was bringing all this to come to pass, and it just doesn't happen overnight. It happens at God's timing and God's will. But you can see it. You can take a look at that. Now, there's one more way I want to look at these 100 years that you may have not thought about yet. And so let's take a look at it from this perspective. I'm calling this the 100 years of transformation. So I'm going to put up a little chart. We have the chart going in. I'm going to put 3 time periods in. We're going to start with 1917. 1917 to 2017, 100 years. So now we have 100 years of what's taking place. What's interesting when you look at the duality of events, it was Israel that was warned for about 100 years before their fall. So it's interesting now that we have about 100 years before its return of the fulfillment of armies surrounding Jerusalem. Just a little side note I wanted to give you so you can think about, just something to think about. 50 years is the Jubilee in God's plan. Now, when I'm put up here 50 years Jubilee, this is not, I don't know that this is the true Jubilee. But what it is 50 years. And 50 years represents freedom. So what I put there is from the time that they began to go into, from a British, which was an Israelite nation, step foot back in that land until they took over control of Jerusalem, which was when? 1967. It took 50 years. In other words, it took 50 years till God finally brought them total freedom of that city. Like a Jubilee. That's what I wanted to put there. All right, so now we have from 1950, so now we go from 67 to 2017. We have another 50 years. So if God brought it from entering into the land to controlling Jerusalem, what does he have in plan here? It's another type. It's another 50 years that's gone by. So here we're looking at 1917. The land of Israel plays back to the hands of an Israelite nation, which was Great Britain. I see the picture of General Allenby walking in. Then we come to 2017. Now this event, I believe that we're going to look back at this event as a sign that God gave us, this constellation star. We've done several sermons about that. It's talking about Revelation 12. When you look at the book of Revelation, which happens to be just one chapter before chapter 13, where we're talking about the rise of the beast, right? Just one chapter. So is it a time sequence? I don't know, but it sure looks that way. It sure looks that way. So then you have also at this time is the recognition of the capital of Israel. So we have the United States again, which is another Israelite nation. You got Ephraim and Manasseh, United States of Great Britain. We come through, we got 2 50-year periods. The United States now finally took 50 years for the first country ever to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which is the first time that's been taking place since David, since King David. No other nation wants to recognize Jerusalem as the capital. So we have another 50 years for that to take place. We also have an alignment of the stars showing us that when this begins to take place, he talks about the woman rising up. Right after that chapter, you come to chapter 13, and there we have it again. The beast beginning to rise into power. We're beginning to see that with the Pope beginning to rise in. So here's the thing we bring you now. And there's no way we can know for sure, but it sure appears that God is lining up the events that the armies surrounding Jerusalem could take place sooner than we ever anticipated. Well, I want to bring that to your attention to understand that prophecy doesn't happen overnight. Most of the time, God's building prophecy step by step to make you and I aware. And one of the things we're being aware of today about these prophecies is that stupid little cake that may be more of a warning than we ever imagined. That God let that get out there so you and I will wake up and realize something is taking place. So now let's read the scripture one more time before we move on to bring this to a close of our program today. And when you shall see the Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Luke 21, verse 20. So there you have it as our little take, talking about the fulfillment of this prophecy and what lays ahead. Okay, all right, from the home office this week, December 22nd, we want to bring you 2 DVDs. We mentioned last week they were going out. Well, they're out. First is a sermon by Danny Ellis called The Bride of Christ. And the second is the part 2 in 2 years into the millennium. And I mentioned that earlier in the program. Be sure to get your DVDs. In fact, don't get on the mailing list and you can go online and get these. We mail you a card every month so you can get the DVDs talking about these programs. This week also, the website has added 30 new sermons to God's Unchanging Word YouTube channel. That's a lot of sermons. God's blessed us with a lot of speakers who are actually in the COGMI and associate with us, and we like to use all those sermons to bring them to you to get a multiplicity of talent that God's using through so many different people who help us to grow our church. Okay, December 25th. This was a sermon I delivered last week, December 25th, called The Day of the Invincible Son. So that sermon was delivered last week right here in our studios. My brother has worked diligently to get this put together so that this sermon is going to be available to you. And when you get this News Nuggets and Insight, there will be a link so that you can have this sermon available to play tomorrow or the rest of this weekend during the Christmas season. And that sermon is going to bring about some interesting facts that you may not or have never covered about the day of the invincible Son. So pay attention to that sermon, especially the end. And I believe it's going to bring some very exciting insight into God's plan. So if you haven't seen that sermon yet, by all means, download it and have it ready. Play it to your congregations this weekend, December 25th, the day of the invincible Son. Well, a lot of people are going to be in Lexington, Kentucky this week, including me. Jim O'Brien and company up there have invited us to be with them this weekend. And for their movie night, which will be on Monday night, they will be playing The Constitutional Christian. And then I've been invited up there to do a question and answer session following the video. So if you're in the area or you're at the weekend, they're expecting 400 or 500 people up there, getting the children away from the actual Christmas season to have their own family weekend. By all means, stop by, say hello, and we will be passing out the Constitutional Christian following that video that night. Well, there you have it. That's it for this week's edition for News, Nuggets, and Insights. So before we close our program, we'd like to bring you a video. So what we decided to do this week, since we're going to be playing the Constitutional Christian at the Winter Family Weekend, we thought we would whet your appetite and play the actual intro of the special, which runs a little over 5 minutes long. So take a look. Hope it whets your appetite. You come out and see it, and I'll be right back.
For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this vast sea to possess it.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. God bless.
I dwell on this prospect with every satisfaction which an ardent love for my country can inspire, since we ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained.
And we're at a point in America today where that out of the 370,000 churches in America, only 28% of churches believe the Bible. So we now have 72% of churches who don't even believe the Bible.
I think anytime a nation turns away from truth, turns away from holiness and righteousness, there are consequences.
We're at a point where that last year only 9% of Christians actually read the Bible on a daily basis. And when you ask Christians, have you ever read the Bible through from cover to cover? Less than 5% have ever read the Bible cover to cover.
This notion that the Constitution is a living document. Well, no, it's when people say that, what they typically mean is that we can reinterpret it according to a new culture. Well, that's like saying that we can reimagine the Bible to mean something it's never meant because, well, culture has changed. And the question is, what's the tuning fork?
This is the highest level of biblical illiteracy we've ever had in American history. And as a result, we're moving secular, and as a result, the Constitution doesn't work as well. And so the judicial system's not working the way it's supposed to, the economic system's not working the way it's supposed to, education's not working the way it's supposed to, frustration with government is at the highest level in recorded history, the government's not working. Well, when you get away from the original blueprint, it won't work well. But that original blueprint involves God and the Bible, and that's just what people don't know today.
There's a consequence to sin. It doesn't matter who does it. It doesn't matter when it's happening. It has no boundaries. It's a universal reality that the wages of sin is death. Scripture says that. God's not going to be mocked. So there's no way that we're going to say, well, that was true up until now, but we've found a way to circumvent God's law. We can't circumvent it.
This past summer, when we began working on the Constitutional Christian, the nation was in the throes of the most bitterly fought election in modern times. The plumb line had been drawn. In the balance, well, the future of America. And that hinged on the foundation of the Constitution and the next Supreme Court justice. As the world held its breath, the voters went to the polls and America spoke. Where do we go from here? We'll talk about that today on the Constitutional Christian. Well, I hope you appreciated that intro. Just wanted to whet your appetite. The program runs a little bit over an hour, I think an hour and 6 or 7 minutes. We're going to be playing that special up in Lexington, Kentucky. Hope to see you there. Well, that's it for our program today. I hope you enjoyed this edition for News, Nuggets, and Insights. Till next week, one more program to the end of 2017. Stay tuned. God be with you until next week.